Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the second Innovation Insights Research Seminar for winter 2025. My name is Becky Matz, and I'm a research scientist here at the Center for Academic Innovation. I'm excited to welcome you all today. So under the broad umbrella of the Innovation Insights series, we here at CAI are aiming to bring together people who want to just share their knowledge, improve learner success, and kind of ambitiously transform education. And in this series of research talks, we are simply aiming to discuss the latest in applied educational research and practice. Ultimately, we want to better support learners, both those in residential situations and those online. And today I'm really excited to have Dr. Yiwen Lin here with us to share about her work studying equity in online learning teams. Yiwen is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Pittsburgh and recently completed her PhD at the University of California at Irvine, studying gendered gaps and inclusivity in STEM. And I'm particularly geeked for this research talk because I think it really, at least for those of us here at the Center for Academic Innovation, it really cuts across, I think it's going to cut across basically every aspect of our center. So I'm really quite looking forward to it. So Yiwen, thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon. We're looking forward to hearing your talk. And as soon as we get the slides switched, you can go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thanks, Becky. Can everyone see my slides?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So thank you so much for the introduction. I am really honored to be here, and it felt very special to me because I was once an undergrad at University of Michigan. I actually did have an opportunity to spend some time at the Academic Innovation Office when I was working with Dr. Christopher Brooks at the UMSI. And so I was learning from a lot of folks the behind the scene about curriculum designs and how do you design tools for students and instructors and courses for online learning. And that really sparked my interest and desire to learn more and start a PhD in this area. So I'm really grateful to be able to come back and share with you all some of the things that I learned in the past few years doing some work in the space of online learning, and also particularly women in STEM with a lens of equity in learning. And so we know that the field of education has progressed quite a lot in the past few decades in increasing diversity and equity in STEM, but there's still a lot of work to do, and particularly across the lines of gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic backgrounds, we can still see a relatively evident gaps in STEM interest, students' participation, and also their retention rate. And so to create a more inclusive environment towards the goal of that, I think it's important to first identify where the problem exists and what are the issues that we're still working with, and also thinking about how we can design targeted and informed intervention that effectively addresses them. So I am going to use some of the example from my work, a lot of them in collaboration with others, to talk about 3 areas where I think learning analytics and AI can really help contribute to this goal of expanding equity in online education. And so in the first section, I'll talk about how in a series of studies, we try to identify gaps or the lack thereof, and how we try to find areas for potential future intervention that might be beneficial for different groups of students. And in the second part, I'm going to use some examples to illustrate how we use some data-driven approaches to detect unequal participation that may otherwise go unnoticed in online team environments. And lastly, this is sort of going back to a higher level as it might be pertaining to some interest of folks here. We did a conceptual piece last year discussing the potential of AI particularly generative AI, as it was all the hype when ChatGPT came out. In thinking about how we can leverage further analytics and AI to cultivate equitable environments for online learners, particularly online teams. And so I hope this kind of come together. I compiled a series of studies, and in the parts where I may be glossing over certain details, please ask me in the Q&A for illustrating more of that. So I am going to, just to provide the context, most of these studies that I'll be mentioning are situated in online courses, and the focus and the lens for diversity would be limited to women in STEM, and this is not the entirety of issue that we should be discussing in diversity and equity, but that has been the focus of my lines of work in the past. Okay, so I think to start with, in studying with a new group of learners, there should be some questions that we always ask again and again. And there are basic questions such as, how are our students learning? How are they doing? And what drives their learning? And this could look quite different when we look at a student in a different context. So when I got the opportunity to work in collaboration with this online learning community called Neuromatch Academy, which is a nonprofit that were organized by a group of academics and professionals in the field of neuroscience to compile and structure an online course for students around the world to learn about computational neuroscience and the applications of computation in the field of neuroscience. I was curious to see whether some of the persistent gaps that we found in learners' interest and also their psychological experience, such as belonging and STEM identity, whether those gaps still exist, and how do they look like with this group of students. So we asked we asked students to rate how likely is it that your eventual career after graduation would directly pertain to mathematics or science. And out of the students who filled out our survey, which is a bit over 1,000 students, and most of them were actually graduate students. So all of the students participating in the course were undergraduate and above. And the gender ratio in this group of students were relatively balanced. About 45% students were female. So when we asked these questions, we were expecting perhaps there might be a similar gap as found in many other studies before. But in this case, we actually observed that students responded quite similarly across men and women, that they all expressed relatively high interest in STEM persistence. What we did find was that women showed slightly lower readiness as seen from the knowledge test that we were giving them at the beginning of the course to get an idea of how familiar they are with the core mathematics and computation knowledge that would be essential for the course. And furthermore, we were more curious about whether some of the factors that found to be important to these outcomes that we care about. For instance, the literature has outlined the importance of STEM belonging and STEM identity for fostering students' interest in continuing their trajectory in STEM. And we wanted to know whether that link between belonging, identity, and persistence manifests the same for men and women. And we were inspired to kind of replicate this test as a lot of the studies that we found illustrate this importance for women in particular. And in a paper that we sort of based this model on, there was evidence to show that belonging is particularly important for women, driving their desire to remain in STEM, but not quite the same for male students in their data sample. Excuse me. And we also hypothesized that self-efficacy might be also important in driving students' levels of readiness, and in turn may inspire them to feel more confident and more strongly desire to remain in the field. And so to test that, we did a path model separately for men and women in this course. And what we found was that there are some evidence that really illustrate what we thought and kind of reinforces what the literature has thought. We found that field belonging and identity were indeed very strongly connected to women's desire to remain in STEM. However, as we hypothesized that there might be an indirect effect of self-efficacy, we did not really observe that, but in fact, there was a direct link between how confident students think they can handle and manage their learning and their desire for continuing the STEM journey. This is true for women, however, we did not observe the same effect for men. And I'll talk about what this might mean a little bit later. What's interesting to me, at least when I saw this result, what stood out was that we found the effects from belonging and identity were equally strong for men. And in fact, if you look at the tiny little score on the coefficient, belonging actually demonstrate a stronger link for too persistent for male students as well. So this is a little bit different from how we expected the result might be before we start the analysis. The main takeaway is that we reran some of the examination that has and questions that has been constantly asked across different studies in different contexts. And this kind of gets to the point of the importance of re-examining and updating our knowledge when we come to work with the new groups of students. And in this case, context could be quite important for explaining and interpreting some of those results. For instance, when we did not observe an evident gap between between men and women for STEM persistent, one of the explanation for that may come up with the self-selection in this online course. As students signing up for this course, we may consider that they are already more motivated and having a stronger interest in continuing their STEM journey in the first place. So that may explain sort of the lack of gaps in STEM persistence. But it also sort of from the result where we found that belongings were equally important for men and women, it seems it will be quite important to further model student data and understand the underlying mechanisms that drive students' learning for different learners so that we can tailor support. And in this case, we realized that targeting belonging can still be an important area for fostering sense of belonging. But for women in particular, what we haven't considered before is potentially by strengthening their self-efficacy. And that could be a potential route that would benefit women's desire to remain in STEM. So I want to expand a little bit further in thinking about how we may foster belonging. And to think about intervention to foster belonging, there are multiple ways that people have done before in an online course. And this has been kind of a persistent challenge for online learning, as there was a lower level of interaction for students, and it's harder for students to get a sense of community when they're participating in an online course. With this course, there's a unique mechanism that the course team decided to implement. This takes a lot of effort and investment, but what they did, this is the same course that I was talking about in the previous study, and this is kind of a work in progress still. So they decide to implement a small group learning mechanism in this large-scale online course in a way to create a sense of stronger community and connection with the peers and also instructor. So students were broken out into groups of about 10 to 15 students, and they called it for each small group, they called it referred to a pod. So in each pod, they were assigned a TA designated to help students with their tutorial, and they would meet actually online on Zoom, and there will be designated time in each learning day where the teachers and students will interact with their pod mates. And so in such way, the course teams would hope that students would have a better learning outcome by having the stronger interaction with their peers and the instructional teams. And what we were curious about is whether the group dynamics and the way that students are interacting in groups have a potential connection to their sense of belonging, and whether this could be a useful mechanism for fostering students' sense of belonging. So we asked students at the end of each learning day to fill out a shorter version of the survey, and we asked them to rate their group dynamic from 1 to 5, 1 being very negative and 5 being very positive, how they perceive the social interaction in their group. And we collected data throughout the entire period of the 3 weeks instructional time. And what we did was to aggregate the daily responses into an average score for each student. And further, we wanted to test if that is the perceived pod dynamics or perceived group dynamics is in any way linked to students' sense of belonging, and whether that in turn has an effect on students' STEM persistent desire. And this is important to note because students who are underrepresented in STEM are known to potentially have and more amplified psychological experience in a small group. So if in a small group environment, it is a really positive experience, there is a chance that we may boost students' confidence and belonging further. However, if it's a very negative interaction experience with their peers, there's a risk where underrepresented students would perceive a stronger or more negative psychological experience, and thus that could potentially hurt their belonging. And so what we did was a mediation analysis with the same group of students that I was talking about earlier, but this time we were looking at their belonging reported on the post-course survey, so the number of student responses reduced to about 524. We did a mediation analysis to test whether there's a link between group dynamics and belonging, and furthermore, STEM retention. And what we found was that for both men and women, there is a equally strong connection from group dynamic to STEM belonging, and that is further linked to students' retention desire. And this tells us, indicate that improving group dynamics could potentially benefit both genders equally in terms of boosting belonging and subsequently their desire for retention. And so this whole study, these 2 sets of study kind of illustrate the importance of understanding what drives students' learning, and furthermore, where are the areas that we can consider for potential intervention. And in this case, we found that facilitating effective group dynamics can be potentially quite important for cultivating a more inclusive psychological experience. But here comes another challenge. Understanding or monitoring group dynamics aren't always easy. And so now I'm going to jump to the second part where I discuss what are some of the ways that we can potentially detect imbalanced interactions or unequal participation in groups. For any of us who have taught an online course or been in an online seminar of any kind, we know that it can be quite tricky to know what's happening in the entire classrooms, particularly when students were broken out into a breakout room. It's pretty much an entire dark spot. For when I was TAing, I have no idea to know what's happening in the breakout rooms unless when I'm also in a room. So to address this potential challenge, there are a few ways that the literature can suggest to quantify participation and get some sense of the level of engagement for students in these groups. And the most simple way to approach that was to understand, first of all, how many times students are talking, and that's characterized as conversational turns. And secondly, how much students are talking. And we can easily look at the amount of words or the frequencies of word counts to kind of represent that. And lastly, we might also be curious about how much students are talking compared to their peers. And one of the ways to do that is to consider the proportion of contributions one student have out of their entire group. So we tested this in an environment where students were assigned to groups of 3, and this study, again, is in work in progress and in collaboration with folks from University of Colorado Boulder. So we ran this study where students were randomly assigned into groups of 3, and what they needed to achieve is to talk to each other and try to use physics principle to solve a problem. And the problem being guiding this little green dot from left to the destination, which were marked out by this red dot. Within limited time, students would want to try to solve as many problems as possible. And so we have about 264 students and about 88 teams. Each time students come on, they have 15 minutes to try to solve as many problems, and they did that twice. And so we looked at the gender differences of participation in this case using word counts, turns, and proportional turns. What we found was that, first of all, on the graphs on the left, that women spoke fewer words in general. And that is true for women in a team where they're all women, and also in teams where there are a mixed gender. And when we look further into proportional turns, we found that women in male-dominated teams spoke significantly fewer times compared to their peers. And this may indicate that in male-dominant teams, male students were taking up more space on average compared to their female counterparts. And this is all at individual level. We did not observe this this kind of imbalances in women-dominated teams. And as we can see from this graph, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the female majority teams, the participation of all students were rather equal. And so this may suggest that we can use some sort of surface level indicators to find out whether students are participating, how much they're engaging. But another side of engagement is deeper than the surface level or the amount of participation that we care about. And the lesser and the more difficult area for assessment lies in understanding how students are engaging and participating. So in one of my earlier studies, where we looked at an online course with undergraduate students, we found that although students are participating relatively similarly, some of the aspect that captures the quality of participation were different for men and women. And in this case, we ran a deeper analysis on the transcripts of students' collaboration. And we try to take into account of the semantic relations of student interaction to understand if students are building on to each other, and at the same time, whether those contributions are novel. And what we found was that on average, female students were better at responding to their teammates, building onto their contributions, and also being more cohesive with their own participation. So this raised the questions. As team-based learning is becoming more integrated with a lot of courses, how can we design assessment that captures both levels of participation and also the quality of participation that may be more important for understanding where inequality lies in group learning? And these analysis, more than ever, we have more computational power and potential to integrate those into tools to help provide feedback to students and instructors. And I know that there are really great teams at Michigan already taking the lead in doing that. I learned about Tandem while I was a grad student, and that's a wonderful tool that illustrates a lot of the team statistics that allow us to gain a deeper insights into what's happening and how we can interpret these data and what we can do about it. And so now I'm going to switch gear to kind of talk about this conceptual piece that we did in collaboration with my mentor, Nia Nixon, and colleague Lauren Snow. So when generative AI became all the hype around the end of 2022, and more so in the year of 2023, there were a lot of discussions around what we could do about it, where are the potential for it. And we decided to think about it through the lens of equity. And here are some of the few ideas that we have. And I hope to invite some discussions and questions in this area too. So we sort of conceptualized that it is useful for AI to help us assess and model collaborative processes rather than only collaborative outcomes. And this means this may require us to collect trace data such as text or interactive data for students' behavior in the learning management system. And we can potentially process these data at scale to characterize patterns that may require attention. Like I mentioned previously, perhaps this could look like we try to understand whether there are signs of domination in a small group when the instructor may not have all the capacity to oversight every single group when they're happening at the same time. And furthermore, we think that it could be really useful to leverage AI to help us generate interpretable outcomes from these analytics and interpret it in such way that is digestible and meaningful for instructors and other stakeholders, such as students or people who are driving policies and course designers and so on. And the next idea is to really push this idea of thinking more deeply about the intersection of multiple groups and multiple student identities in the space of quantitative insights. A lot of the literature focusing on intersection identity in STEM learning has been largely coming from qualitative studies. And so we're thinking if we can contribute some more large-scale quantitative insight in that regard, which some people may already starting to do, but still relatively scarce in this area, that can really help us dissect different learning experiences and patterns for underrepresented students in STEM. And the next ideas that we have is that we have seen a lot of this hyper-personalized intelligent tutoring system to help students design their own pathways and really adapt to their styles of learning. And why don't we come up with something for the teams as well? So this idea is to think about how we might extend from personalized support to designing agents and systems that support the entire team, particularly teams that have diverse needs and diverse styles of interaction. And we also wanted to invite this thinking around how we can go beyond providing cognitive support. For instance, a lot of tools help students gather knowledge and help students illustrate certain concepts, but how can we design agents that also pay attention to the psychological aspects within team interaction? And this would require a lot more thinking into the designing aspect of any student or instructor-facing tools. But we want to start thinking about that in order to expand our effort into thinking about how to create a more inclusive environment. And the next thing is this idea that we gleaned from one paper that discussed the potential for integrating AI as a teammate rather than only a tool that we use for accessing knowledge, and how we might design certain teammates to participate in the team problem-solving process more deeply and help beyond facilitating tasks. And one of the benefits that comes from that can potentially be this kind of transition into the next idea of having simulated interaction for students. And the benefit of that, as illustrated in this paper from Cohen et al., can potentially be giving students the role model that they might not have a chance to interact with, to kind of challenge their stereotypes, and also help them to be able to interact with people in a way that they feel more comfortable. And in another scenario, it could be for helping students who have never had the chance to be in a very diverse environment, to simulate interaction such that it cultivate their collaboration and communication skills. And lastly, we also thought of the idea of leveraging generative AI for inclusive awareness training that inspire teammates to gather diverse perspectives and cultivate cultural sensitivities. Again, a lot more thinking should go into that. And the feedbacks from instructors and students would definitely necessary in order for any of these areas to be taken further. It also comes with challenges that we should recognize at any time that we talked about any integrations of AI models. There will be privacy concerns that arise and things such as algorithmic biases and fairness concerns that we always have to take very careful consideration about. But as we discussed, there are some of the potentials. Deploying AI system can be really promising in expanding equity, as long as we take very careful and thoughtful consideration into how we design that and do a lot of tests before anything were implemented into real learning environments. Okay, so to summarize, I touched on a few areas where data analytics and lastly, AI more broadly can be beneficial for creating an inclusive and equitable online learning. And the first thing that I mentioned in the first section was really to always consider re-examining a new groups of students that we're looking at, and also provide evidence-driven, data-driven details on where we should be paying attention to and where we may consider designing certain interventions. And the next thing, I want to highlight the importance of dynamic assessment, particularly on team processes. This has not been done as much in the actual teaching and learning, but it's potentially going to become more and more integrated with the classroom as team-based learning are becoming more and more common. And lastly, we wanted to think more deeply about how we can leverage AI as a tool for equity. And this would perhaps be always a constant discussion in the community as we move forward with it. And so with that, that is sort of the things that I wanted to share with you all. And I want to invite any questions, comments, and I'll open it up to the floor.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for sharing these studies, Yiwen. I'll ask a question while folks are kind of collecting their thoughts, and maybe we'll try to use the raise hand feature under React, just so we make sure we get to folks kind of in order. But while folks are thinking of their own questions, I wanted to ask you about in your second study, where you were showing some of the group communication analysis results. Yeah, the pink and that like pink and gray one. And I just wanted to ask a little more about the category of internal, is it internal cohesion? And like how is that characterized, and sort of how is that reified in the data? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of my very first study that I have taken a step into looking at gender differences. And this actually is a tool developed by my mentor, Yiwen Lin, in characterizing team dynamics through text-based data. So what we did was adapting a LSA, a latent semantic analysis method, which is one of the methods in natural language processing. But basically what it does is it allows us to capture the immediate context of someone's text in front and behind what comes before and what comes after. So a simple way to illustrate that, I didn't do a really good job at talking about that, is this is a little bit more context aware and dependent on what is being said before me and what is being said after me. So in this way, we're able to see if I'm building to someone that has talked in front of me and someone that has talked after me. And so for the measure regarding internal cohesion, we're taking out students' individual contributions to see whether what I'm saying now is coherent compared to what I said just before. So there is the intrapersonal aspect in the first two measure where I try to capture the impact, which indicate the uptake from previous students, and overall responsivity, which is also more intrapersonal. And the internal cohesion is a measure that's more intrapersonal, so within the person, to kind of look at whether what they've been talking about is kind of coherent, or they talk about one thing now and drastically the topic changed in the next thing that they say. But if you want more details, I'm happy to send you a paper that illustrates much more deeper into how these measures are calculated. But again, I try my best I hope it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that was helpful. Thanks. Karen, you want to go ahead?
Thanks. I didn't know if I could remove my own audio. So I've got two questions. One, and first, thank you. This is all really interesting. Going back to the very beginning, when you had said that there was a course and you had this large sample size of 1,124 students who agreed to participate, what was the population size? And within your analysis, did you adjust for, I don't know, sampling error or whatever? What kind of response rate was there? Was there anything that supports the statistics with respect to the sample?
Yeah, so the entire course was 1,600 students. And because the participation in research studies were entirely voluntary, and it does take out time for students to complete these extra survey, and even though it's voluntary, students were not required to answer all the surveys, there is an aspect of their data being captured. So another thing that we try to do, and this is only true for this particular course, we acquire data for subsequent years as well. But in 2021, participating in research also has a layer of asking students to be recorded when they have the Zoom interaction, because we wanted to know how their interaction goes in their separate groups. So I think this is at least for the survey results, it's relatively high. I would say 1,100 out of 1,600s. So the students were from all different places around the world, as this was a course that is intended for global audiences. Actually, primarily students were joining from outside of the United States. So in some of our analysis, when we look at the gender differences across belonging, identity, and self-efficacy, we take into account of where students are based at, what are their levels, whether they're in undergraduate or graduate status, what is their first language, because that could be important for understanding the content material if they're not a native English speaker when the course was delivered entirely in English. So we try to account for those, and we did find that women score a little bit lower for sense of belonging, but it's not a very big difference in this case. So I don't know if that completely addressed your question.
Yes, that speaks to it. Thank you. But I had just one other question, and I think unfortunately I missed this, and I'm so sorry to have to ask, but what did you find with respect to self-efficacy versus the knowledge score for men versus women?
Yeah, let me come back to that. So this is interesting to me to see that there's a direct link between self-efficacy to women's desire for STEM retention, because the ways that we ask self-efficacy, and I should illustrate that earlier, was not specifically about their efficacy in STEM. So this is a general question asking how confident you are that you can manage your study. It's a set of questions that we adapted from kind of a validated instrument. And it's an aggregated score from other responses students have. What we did not see was this link between self-efficacy and persistence for men. In fact, if you look a little bit closer at the link between self-efficacy and knowledge score for men, there's a very tiny negative correlation. And
Oh, it's not.
yeah, a potential interpretation for that will, well, we're not sure if this is true, as we didn't follow up with any qualitative studies to ask the students specifically about this. But potentially, male students who have very confident actually didn't perform so well on their test. And there might be a potential kind of a disconnect between how well they think they could do and how well they actually did on a knowledge test. So that link was not present for women between self-efficacy and knowledge score. But in observing this connection between self-efficacy and persistence, one of the ways that we thought could be a takeaway from the study is that potentially by reinforcing student self-efficacy, that could be beneficial to their STEM persistence. And we're not saying that we would do this within the scope of this course, but outside of this course, how can we test that or try this design with other students during a longer learning period? And again, this is a much shorter and intensive learning period where implementation of intervention have be well thought out to see any effect happening by the end of the teaching period.
And just really quickly, last thing, what do you think about the whole idea of AI being an opportunity for personalizing everything, support and included? If you were to forget the male-female sort of aspect, you don't have to answer now, but one of the things I'm wondering as you went to the AI part was just sort of, aside from male-female differences, what opportunities there might be for personalization, for example, within the small groups and all that. So I won't go into any detail, but it's just, I just wondered if the personalization aspect was something that you were thinking about with respect to AI.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can see that it is already being done in a lot of the learning tools that we have. One of the things that I do is knowledge tracing to use your learning trajectory before to kind of predict what you need in the future. And one of the adaptation of that in team environment can potentially be, let's say I have this consistent interaction with my teammates in this online course and we're being assigned into a small group. A version of that could look like I have this AI monitoring how my participation has been. And it might come to me and nudge me a little bit to see, hey, I haven't seen you been participating more. How are you feeling? How are you doing with your teammates? And actually, one of PhD students in my previous lab, they're hoping to design a responsive AI agent within the team to nudge the entire team into a more balanced interaction by telling someone who seemingly kind of falling off to re-engage them back into the conversation. And it's a very complex process, as designing a more natural feeling agent is really tricky. And students actually reported that they really don't like when they were feeling like they're being pushed by a machine or an AI agent. So there's a lot of consideration that needed to go into the implementation of that, but a lot of interesting ideas have been already tested in other studies. So
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Other folks? Questions, comments, points of interest, points of overlap? Any of the above? A quiet crowd today. I will ask one more, as long as we're on this slide, because I did note a question that I was thinking about while you were sharing this set of pathways, which is that I wonder what you would say. What do you say? Like, do you have any reason to hypothesize that these paths are the same or different for a residential course? Like, do you think there's something specific to sort of the online setting here, or do you think that you might see the same results in a residential setting?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And actually, I would respond to that by sort of using this previous study that we had inspiration from, which actually situate in the institutional environment. So what they did was quite similar. They looked at whether belonging, efficacy are linked to persistence, and they also added and consideration for the exam scores. And this is sort of where we built our expectation from, where women have displayed a stronger link between belonging and persistence. And I think in an institutional environment where there is a greater variance in terms of where students are and where their backgrounds are, where they come from, there could potentially be a greater differences that we observe here. In the online learning environment, and in this case in particular, one of the things that we still need to unpack is the complexity of students' personal characteristics. So students join from all different educational backgrounds. A lot of them did not complete, well, when we see a lot of institutional based studies, a lot of them are based in US or based within a specific country. And in this case, it's people coming from all different places coming together. And so what happens in the history of their learning before is hard to completely unpack that. But how do we also take into account of these variations culturally and geographically into that? It's something that we wanted to do next. And yeah, it's quite interesting because even if you look at another online learning setting, such as MOOCs, there could be different patterns as well. And I recently came across large-scale studies in MOOCs that illustrate there is a belonging differences. But when they try to do an intervention, it wasn't the effect that they hope it would be. And so there's a lot more complexity involved in online learning. I think when we conduct studies in an institutional environment, we have much more student level data, administrative level data to understand what their high school GPA might be, where their previous learning can potentially influence the sense of belongings and persistent desire. So I think it could, long story short, I think it could look different. And that's, again, why it's necessary to keep updating our knowledge. Sometimes interventions were designed based on the theories and existing evidence that are very, very strong. But there's always a chance that that may not be true with a particular groups of students that we're looking at. So, yeah.
Thank you. All right, we'll do one last call. Any folks out there with a lingering question or comment? Speak now or forever hold your peace. All right. Oh, Rachel.
Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. I'm curious as to whether, or if you know of sort of similar online learning programs like the one you studied in less sort of parity, but like achieved, words are failing me, in disciplines other than the life sciences, other than biological sciences, right? So a sense of belonging in biology for someone who is identifies as female is less challenged because they see other people like them, or they know of other people like them. And so I'm familiar more with residential studies of looking belonging in different disciplines, but I'm curious in the online space whether you've know of sort of parallels in non-biological sciences.
Yeah, that's actually a very great point. In my other talks where I focus only on this study, I talk about the trickiness in capturing identity in this scenario, because what we ask might not be what students think we're asking. Exactly as you illustrated, this is a interdisciplinary course where students could be coming from a more computational heavy background, or they could be coming from a more biological science background. So actually, an improvement that we wanted to suggest future study is when we look at the intersection of different disciplines. We probably want to, in administrating surveys or designing these questions, we want it to be more nuanced about that, whether it is truly that you're belonging to which area that is driving your persistent desire. And in this case, in this particular course, we did try to look at a course that is not in biological science, that is offered by the same community, the Neuromatch Academy. So they do have a course that primarily focused on deep learning, and now they expanded to 4 more other courses. The limitation of that, we did try to re-ramp these analysis in different years and in different courses. However, actually, to answer your question, I think that because the community that they're primarily focusing on are still neuroscientists, so that kind of make this community more specialized. But what's interesting about that is I think in the future, learning might potentially become more and more specific in a particular applied area. We have an era where learning about AI and computational methods was opened up to everybody because of the easy access for online resources. And now I think that a lot of the fields are moving towards how can we provide courses that tailor the application of computation methods in their specific fields. And now we also see there are programs developed for like a computational methods for education. And so I think it would be really interesting to look at that side, because it's also kind of a grouping a lesser computation heavy discipline traditionally with a very heavy STEM knowledge aspect. So I think more and more studies should focus on this areas of community as they are becoming more popular. So I hope that answers the question. What we try to do is replicate this and see if this generalized to other courses. But then again, in interpreting any of those results, we always want to keep in mind the context and the student characteristic of this group.
All right, folks. It sounds like that's all the news that's fit to print. So we'll stop the questions there. Thank you so much, Yiwen. Thank you so much for your time, for your work in these studies, and for your efforts to share them with us today. We really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to hearing more in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
As folks are kind of finishing up, logging off or whatever, just keep in mind that there is another The last seminar for the year actually is coming up on March 3rd. And we'll be hearing from Karen Stahlberg, a Michigan colleague, about the effects of a MOOC she's been running for quite a long time. And we also hope you will save the date if you haven't already for our research showcase, which is going to be April 30th here in person at the CAI Center for Academic Innovation at 317 Maynard. So we hope you'll mark your calendars for that. There'll be more details coming out in the coming probably month or so. And with that, we'll just say, hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thanks again to Yiwen, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Bye, all.